April 25, 1945, just outside Munich, Germany. The morning air was thick with gunpowder, smoke, and the uneasy stillness of a war nearing its end. The Third Reich was crumbling. American tanks rolled through bomb-scarred villages where white flags hung from shattered windows, and German soldiers, many barely older than boys or older than fathers, surrendered in droves. In one such column, outside the small village of Puschheim, a U.S. patrol intercepted a Wehrmacht logistics convoy, not bristling with weapons, but with steaming pots, flour sacks, and metal ladles. These were German military cooks, members of a field kitchen unit retreating from the Dachau region. Their commanding officer killed days earlier, their orders vague and pointless. They surrendered with barely a word. Expecting to be lined up, interrogated, or simply marched off to a POW camp, they were stunned when an American officer leaned over, squinted, and asked in halting German, "You cooks?" They nodded. Then came the command that made no sense. "Good. You're going to feed everyone." The cooks looked at each other, confused. "Feed whom? The Americans? Other prisoners? Refugees?" "Everyone," the officer repeated. "There's a displaced persons camp a mile from here. Hundreds, Jews, Poles, French, civilians, starving. You'll cook for them." Some of the Germans laughed nervously, thinking this was some sort of psychological trick. Others thought it was a form of punishment. But the Americans weren't joking. That same day, under armed escort, the German cooks were led to a requisitioned barn near a half-ruined village school. There, hundreds of displaced people, recently freed from forced labor, prison transports, and even subcamps, were lying on hay mats, wrapped in blankets, shaking with fever, hunger, and fear. A U.S. medic named Charles McGraw later wrote in his diary, "They were ghosts with eyes." The smell of starvation and typhus clung to everything. We had rations, but not enough. And then someone said, "We have their cooks." The logic was simple, but revolutionary. The Germans had food trucks and the skill to cook in bulk. The Americans had supply lines but limited local knowledge. The civilians needed calories, fast. But to the cooks, the order violated every propaganda-fed instinct they'd been taught. Feed Jews? Feed Poles? Feed Russians? The very people they'd been told were subhuman? "We did not understand," one German corporal, Hans Meissner, recalled decades later in a BBC interview. "We thought they were mad. And maybe they were, but in a holy way." The Americans provided flour, powdered eggs, coffee, army rations, and even looted Wehrmacht stockpiles. Under close guard, the German cooks got to work. By the second day, they had prepared a thick potato stew, hard black bread, and weak ersatz coffee, enough to feed nearly 700 people. The reactions were surreal. Some civilians wept before eating. Others hesitated, believing it was poisoned. One Polish teenager reportedly threw the food back, convinced it was a trick. But hunger overcame trauma. Soon, lines formed, steam rose, and for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, people sat together, eating something warm. Witnesses described the scene as absurd and holy at once. Former SS labor victims slurping soup cooked by German soldiers under the watch of American rifles. "It felt like a bad dream," wrote French survivor Lucille Durand in a letter home. "I kept thinking, this is what peace might look like. Madness and mercy, side by side." But not everyone agreed with the decision. Some American soldiers voiced their outrage. "Why the hell are we letting the Nazis feed our people?" one lieutenant barked, according to a diary from Private Anthony Delgado. The response from the commanding officer was chilling in its clarity. "Because they helped starve them. They can help unstarve them." It wasn't mercy. It was accountability and transformation. Day by day, the makeshift kitchen grew. Red Cross workers arrived with more supplies. American MPs rotated shifts, making sure the cooks didn't slip poison into the food. But as the days passed, the tension lessened. Some of the German cooks, still in uniform, began helping lift buckets of water, disinfect wounds, and even clean the latrines, tasks they'd never imagined performing for those they once saw as enemies. It broke something in us, Meissner recalled. The lies, the slogans, the orders, they melted. These people were human, more human than we'd been in years. This wasn't an isolated incident. As Allied troops surged deeper into Germany, liberating camps and discovering the horror of Nazi crimes, they were confronted with a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Between April and May 1945, tens of thousands of displaced persons flooded the roads, forests, and rail lines. Many were starving. Others were near death. General Eisenhower himself wrote on April 19th, after visiting Ohrdruf, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony will be forever seared in my memory." But after the shock came the question, how do you feed millions? One answer came from the very people who had enabled the starvation, captured Wehrmacht logistics and cook units. At an abandoned Luftwaffe base near Würzburg, U.S. officers repurposed 2 German field kitchens to feed over 1,200 liberated prisoners. In Leipzig, another group of captured German cooks, this time SS auxiliaries, were forced to help prepare meals under Allied supervision. According to a British field report, the irony was not lost on the cooks. One wept while peeling turnips. The moral implications were staggering. In using former enemies to care for victims, the Allies weren't just solving a logistical challenge. They were staging a quiet reversal of the Nazi worldview. The people once labeled unworthy of life were now being served meals. And the servers were those who had once believed in their inferiority. One American chaplain, Father Paul Redman, called it an act of theological retribution, a restoration of the sacred human order. Of course, not all German cooks participated willingly. Some refused orders and were separated from the rest. Others attempted sabotage and were court-martialed. But many, faced with the collapse of their ideology and the reality of human suffering, complied, some with guilt, some with shame, and a few with something like hope. I had cooked for officers who laughed while people starved, another unnamed German POW later said in a 1946 Red Cross oral history. But here, in that barn, I cooked for a Polish girl who kissed my hand, and I wept like a child. Meanwhile, American soldiers watched the transformation with a mixture of skepticism and awe. Sergeant Tom Vickers of the 20th Armored Division wrote in a letter to his fiancée, "There's this old Nazi cook who salutes me every morning. Then he makes breakfast for a dozen Jews who were in Dachau last week. If you told me this a month ago, I'd have laughed in your face." Other soldiers took photos, grainy black and whites showing German POWs ladling soup into dented tin bowls, while barefoot children smiled behind them. These images, largely forgotten by history, captured something extraordinary: redemption without permission. A fragile moment when war paused and something else, reconciliation maybe, slipped through the cracks. The operation lasted about 10 days. By early May, supply chains stabilized, more Red Cross stations arrived, and the German cooks were transferred to formal POW camps. Some would remain imprisoned for years. Others were quietly released during denazification efforts. Most faded into obscurity, their names lost, their stories unrecorded. But the people they fed remembered. In a 1978 reunion of Holocaust survivors in Paris, several attendees recalled the Puchheim kitchen, as they called it. One woman, Eva Klein, stood up and said, "They were the enemy, but they fed me, and that confused me more than the camps ever did." It's easy to romanticize these events, to paint the cooks as redeemed figures. But history is more complicated. Many had participated, directly or indirectly, in the system that starved millions. Their hands were not clean. Feeding the hungry did not erase what came before, but it did something else. It made clear that in the ruins of ideology, human choices still mattered. that compassion could be commanded, that even obedience, when pointed in the right direction, could feed the future rather than destroy it. And for the Americans, it was a moment of moral clarity in a war that had blurred so much. Lieutenant Harold Jensen, who oversaw the kitchen detail, wrote in his memoir, "We had a choice, punish them or use them. I chose to use them, not because they deserved it, but because the people in that barn deserved to live." World War II is remembered for its battles, its horrors, its clear lines between good and evil. But within that black and white picture are thousands of stories like this, small, strange, deeply human acts that don't fit the usual categories. A handful of captured cooks, a field stove, a barn full of starving strangers. No medals were given, no monuments built, but perhaps, in the quiet clatter of soup ladles and dented pots, something like justice was served. And maybe that's what history too often forgets. Not just the destruction, but the moments when destruction was defied. Not just the evil, but the flickers of good that refused to go out. The command to feed everyone wasn't just a military order. It was a declaration that even in a world on fire, humanity could still be rationed out, one bowl at a time. If you remember this story, remember it not as a miracle, but as a message, that when cruelty ends, the first thing we owe one another is not revenge, but bread. Share this history. Speak it out loud. Because the past only disappears when we stop feeding the future with its truth.